Hi, everyone. We're here with Amy Tran. She provides therapy and is currently completing her training to become a psychologist in Canada. And she's in her last year of the PhD program. So, super qualified and really awesome at what she does. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear what you have to say. I have lots of questions. So, with your Instagram, I find it really cool that you are trying to help make mental health resources really less intimidating for people by posting them in kind of an art form. So, where did that come from?
You know what? I mean, with everything that happened with the pandemic, I just found that I had a lot of free time. I was bored, and then I put together some posts, and that's how it all started. But to take it way back, before I decided to pursue psychology, I actually wanted to pursue art. So I attended art college for about a year, learned some cool tips and tricks there, and just had an opportunity to express myself creatively, and I found that that was lacking. So really, the pandemic was just a great opportunity for me to put everything together, and that's how it came to fruition.
And do you have a lot of people that reach out to you and feel like it's really helping them in a way just to kind of see things in a different light?
Yeah, totally. And that's the best part about it is getting those DMs or comments where people go out of their way to really tell me how much my work has impacted them. So I really appreciate that from the people that do that.
I love that, and it's a really cool Instagram page, which, by the way, if you wanted to shout that out real quick, what your Instagram is.
Sure. My Instagram is Doodled Wellness. So Doodled, Doodled Wellness. And yeah, I'm also on TikTok. So if you have that, I have more of my comical side coming out on that platform too.
Love that. Art meets therapy. We all need a little bit of that. So perfect. You've also done some intense like training work with children and adolescents, and that has kind of taught you things about parent child situations. Now, as adults, you and I would both be in the young adult category. And it's often that we don't find until this point in our lives that there's something that happened to us as a kid that now impacts us today. How often do you see that unfold in therapy, or does it always unfold? Is there always something that happened in childhood that we're always like, well, that relates to what's happening now?
Such a good question. I would say, I don't want to say all the time because 100% is pretty absolute, but maybe I'll say 99.8% of the time, what I'm seeing, we can trace it back to those early years. And maybe the client is not ready to really explore that. But from my perspective, I have kind of a general idea of that link between what's going on now and the past. So I would say it's a big, big, big majority of the people I see where we can link it back. And I mean, those are really primitive years, and those are our first kind of relationships, right? The ones we have with our parents. So it makes sense that it would have such a huge impact on how we see the world, ourselves, and other people.
And do you find it like difficult for people to kind of address that because they are still as an adult? I'm super close with my parents.
Mhm,
I'm not looking back and finding anything, but I'm sure there is something there. Do you
mhm.
find it's harder to do that when there is a close relationship there because you almost don't want to jeopardize it, or you don't want to lose it, or therapy doesn't necessarily work for everyone in a sense. Some people don't think that's the case. So, um do you find that people find it hard to kind of attack that place because it's such a personal moment of their life?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, people say all the time, oh, but I love my parents, or, oh, but I know they did a good job. So it's really holding that space for the person to be like, okay, I love my parents and I know they did the best that they could, but there's some things in which maybe it was outside of their awareness, and they reacted to situations a certain way that had long lasting impacts on us. So, I mean, my perspective of it and what I invite everyone to really see is that most humans are just trying the best that they can, right? With what they know at the time, the resources they have. And I believe parents are doing that too, right? So that is the kind of perspective that I want people to take when we're talking about our parents is that no, they're not maliciously trying to traumatize you or create anxiety and depression in your life. They were just doing their best that they could. And then this is how it turned out, right? So it is tough though for some people to talk about it.
Do you feel too, like from the parent perspective, I'm speaking from a child perspective because I don't have
Yeah.
kids, but speaking from a parent perspective, do you how can you give them tips to be like, you're not going to be perfect, but this is what you can do? Is there things that parents can do to ensure their kids at least grow up in a sense that have an idea of what's happening around them and how to address those situations as they get older?
Yeah. I mean, I think that first of all is to be compassionate towards yourself, right? Like to parent is not only just ensuring survival and that there's food on the table and that the kid is living an enriched life, but it's a lot to help a child label their emotions, work through their emotions. There is so much work involved in that because if you as a parent are not comfortable with emotions, if you as a parent don't know how to handle your own emotions or soothe yourself, it's going to be really hard for you to do that for your child and model that for your child, right? So that's why it comes back to parents are just doing the best that they can. But I would say, like, be compassionate with yourself. Remember that it's a learning process. And if I can invite the parents out there who are listening to think about two things, is to think about safety. So, how can you make your child feel safe? If you think about your child as not just a human being, but a nervous system as well, that will react to a loud voice, that will react to an angry face, and will react to, conflict around the home. How can we make them feel a little bit safe? And also is that all children want to feel validated, seen, and heard. So if they're crying and you think what they're crying about is the silliest thing, before jumping to, well, is it really worth crying about? Acknowledge that you understand where that sadness is coming from. Validate, 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 validate is what I have to say. So, how can we create safety for children? And how can we make sure that they feel validated, even if you disagree? At first, just let your child know that you understand where they're coming from first.
And I think as humans, everybody can feel that sense of validation that we all want, right? That's something that we just keep having throughout our lives. It never goes away.
Right.
Too, I want to know what are some things, we talk about as kids and we grow up as an adults and we learn a lot of things and we process things and you start to see the impact of different life events that have on you, right?
Mhm.
What are some things that maybe we should try to unlearn that maybe have been ingrained into our lives so that we don't necessarily feel like we should unlearn them, but they might need to be unlearned? Like, is there things out there that we just haven't quite understood in the way that we needed to?
Well, I mean, there's just so many things I can think of, right? But I'll backtrack it a little bit and kind of give people a framework to think about this question is that if we think about being a child, we all want to feel safe. We all want to feel seen. We all want to feel heard. And we all want to feel validated, right? But if we don't get those things in our environment, we now develop coping strategies to essentially survive without it. So, what do those coping strategies look like? Well, it could show up as, oh my God, there's so much conflict in the home. And when I voice my opinion or say something, no one understands. So I'm just going to be quiet now and keep the peace. And that's your way to survive in that family dynamic. And now, maybe into adulthood, that's a coping strategy that you've developed. You've learned to just keep quiet. Your opinions don't matter, your feelings don't matter. And of course, that's going to hurt you because you're essentially betraying your own self, right? We want to make our needs known. Or let's say it really felt like mom and dad or whoever in the home really didn't pay any attention to you. But when you stepped up and helped around the home, right, that's when you got attention. That's when they said, oh, you're such a great child. You're so helpful. So now you learned if I people please, I'm going to receive the love and validation I really need. Then into adulthood, that coping response becomes kind of a part of your, let's say, personality, is that you always people please. You can't say no. It's hard for you to set boundaries. So That's another example. Or maybe love was really not modeled in the home. It was something that seemed disastrous to you. There's a lot of conflict. So you learned, I'm going to shut everyone out. I'm going to fend for myself. I don't need anyone. That's a coping response for you to survive. So when you get older, that's kind of what you do. You don't ask for help. You take on a lot on your own. It's hard for you to open up to other people. So the question is, how did you feel when you were growing up? Was there something lacking there that made you feel really safe and loved and seen and validated? And what kind of, coping strategy did you develop? And are you still carrying it into adulthood? And if so, I mean, unlearning, that's a huge thing, right? Obviously,
Mhm.
therapy helps, but really just doing that work to self reflect and observe those urges to use those old coping mechanisms and finding ways to replace them or not use them as much. And obviously, that's easier said than done, but yeah, that's where the work is.
No, and I feel like that framework is something everybody can use and do on their own, whether it's journaling or however they need to lay out the pieces of the puzzle. So I think that's important. And even breaking it down further. I saw online, I don't even remember where I saw it at this point because there's so much information online, right? But somebody
Yeah.
was talking about using words to fill sentences, or the word just to justify things, or just using or hmms a lot to feel like you need to fill the void. Is that like a real thing that we should try to unlearn? One of their examples was using just in emails, like, I'm just reaching out to, see how this is going. Are those things that we need to not do so we get our point across better? Is that taking away from the points we're trying to make? Do you feel like there's even anything to that meaning of these certain words?
Mhm. I mean, from my personal perspective, I mean, I haven't looked into the research or anything, but I do think it kind of takes away from your ability to communicate assertively. And from a reader's perspective, you diminish the point you're trying to make. It takes away credibility. So, something that I hear a lot is, well, maybe I'm going to do this. It's like, no, it's not maybe you're going to do that. You are doing it. So, like, that's a bad example because, if we're brainstorming and I'm like, maybe I'm going to do that. But have you ever talked to someone and they're like, yeah, like maybe I'm just going to do that while they're doing it? It's like, or
Yes.
maybe I'm going to sit here and they're sitting here. And it's like, no, but you are sitting there, right? So I think it actually is this whole culture of like, you don't want to step on people's toes. You don't want to say the wrong thing. So we're so preoccupied with qualifying ourselves and making sure we're not saying the wrong thing. And maybe for people pleasers or perfectionists and people who do experience anxiety, that really, really comes out as well. I know that definitely was something I used to do, and I've been actively working on it. And maybe it comes from a place of being uncomfortable with silences too, the likes and the ums.
Yes. Well, and,
Yeah.
putting myself on total front street here, I am a perfectionist. That is my, like,
Right.
the top of my list of things that I could work on, right? So I do put in just in a lot of things, and I started removing it from emails, and it did feel very empowering. I was like,
Yeah,
"Yes, I do mean that. I'm not just saying that. I do mean this, and I'm
right,
not trying to justify that I need this information or that I want that information."
right.
So I do feel like when I did it, it did empower me in a way to kind of pull back that layer, but it was hard. It's hard to still do it, to actively do it and actively change myself in that manner of a word that I didn't even realize had that kind of a meaning.
Yeah, and we wanna seem polite, right? We don't wanna seem rude, and I will say, perhaps as women as well, it could be harder, the classic, if I'm assertive, now I'm seen as a bitch instead of assertive and powerful and a leader, I'm seen as a bitch, right? Or too bossy, so maybe there's that playing in too. But yeah, it's a really hard thing to navigate.
It absolutely is. And there, is there other things too, like, if we were to look at our professional relationships, right? Especially as women, but in a general sense too, is there situations that you have people in therapy and you're like, how did they get in these situations? And professional relationships can be just as damaging as personal ones, right? We spend so
Mhm.
much time with people in our professional settings. Do you feel like you have just as many people in therapy to deal with professional situations as personal ones?
Oh yeah, 100%. And I mean, I'm primarily work with youth, so it doesn't always come up, but based on the conversations I have with my colleagues and just some of the things I see on Instagram, some of the DMs, yeah, colleagues and supervisors and bosses definitely create conflict in people's lives. And, it's a human relationship. So it's hard. And then with, supervisors in particular, that can be really tricky, or bosses, because there's that power differential, right? So, yeah, do you want to be assertive? Sure. But do you also want to keep your job so you could pay the bills? Yes.
Yes.
Or hard.
And conflict is hard in general. Are there certain just really basic tools to use when you're in a conflict situation, right?
Mhm,
Are there very basic tools that we can give people to kind of lean on? Say they're just in a conflict with anybody in their life.
mhm,
What
mhm.
are some really easy tools to just kind of have in their back pocket when they're in that situation?
Oh, the tricky question, this one. Yeah. I mean, one of the things too, I would say from a psych perspective is if you're in the heat of the moment with someone, what happens is the emotional part of your brain pretty much hijacks the thinking part of the brain, the part of the brain that is in charge of problem solving, making decisions. So if you can, and you're in a conflict situation, give yourself a breather, like literally remove yourself from the situation for a couple of minutes, take a couple of deep breaths so that that part of your brain can come back online. But I will say with conflict, try to use, I statements. Say, I feel this. Try to avoid you statements like when you did this and you make me feel. So try to, direct the kind of conversation to yourself, because people will put their defenses up, right? And also, if you are trying to communicate how you feel or what someone did, you can actually just put it out there and say, I don't want to come off as like I'm blaming you. Or you could say, I know that you did this because of this. So just acknowledging that, like, the person maybe wasn't trying to be malicious, or acknowledging that you are aware of their feelings can really help de escalate the situation. But yeah, it's definitely really hard. And I understand why people are afraid of conflict. So I would say try not to blame the person, try to use I statements, and then also put whatever you're feeling out there in that, like, your intentions, and that you're not trying to blame them or get them angry, to kind of put their defenses down.
And I know conflict situations are so much more complex than just the basic tools, but I think being able to have a few, maybe if you've never even had any, is a good thing. So I wanted to make
Mhm.
sure some
Yeah.
people kind of had some idea of what that may look like. Cause it's hard. Even talking about conflict is hard, right? You don't want to discuss with people that you had a conflict with someone that you love. That's hard in itself.
Yeah,
So
for sure. For sure.
having those tools I think is really awesome for people to use, and totally kind of switching gears here, talking about some unresolved trauma, right? We
Mhm.
discussed that from childhood and stuff a little bit, but when unresolved trauma comes out in a person and they're in a relationship or in their friendships, what do you often see that look like in the person?
Yeah, it really depends on the person, obviously. And I think that goes for most of the topics we're going to
Yeah.
talk about today. But what I would say is before we get to that point, I want to say that, when we experience trauma, first, there can be what I call big T trauma, which is like a really significant event, like a death or a major accident, injury, natural disaster, abuse. Those things I would say are kind of like big T trauma, but there's also something that some people call little T trauma, and it's more subtle, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you as much as big T trauma. So this will be like, some emotional neglect, for example, or not feeling validated from your parents, like these little things that can happen that really make a big impact on us emotionally over time. So when people experience trauma, they don't feel safe and they typically respond in three ways, essentially, or I would say their brain responds in three ways. And that's they either fight, or they flee, like they run away, or they freeze up. And that's when they really shut down. Right?
The
So,
3 Fs, it sounds like 3
yes,
Fs right there.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. Fight, flight, or freeze. And how that's going to show up in the relationship really depends on who that person is, who the other person is, and kind of like which one of those three responses flares up. So, if it's a lack of safety and that's your primary concern, that could look like a lack of trust in other people, difficulties being vulnerable, because if you're vulnerable, you might get hurt, you don't feel safe. It could be completely withdrawing from someone, having a hard time talking about emotions and feelings could be possible. Also, because the nervous system is dysregulated, right? I talked about fighting or running away. That can show up as irritability, right? Or difficulties concentrating, or maybe even just really hyper vigilant of cues. Like you might be making a face, and I'd be like, why are you making that face? Are you mad at me? Because I'm on high alert, right? From the trauma. Or I could be always worrying that something's going on. Another way that it can show up sometimes is, people may reenact past traumas. So, one example would be, let's say, if you have experienced a lot of emotional validation in your life and that was very traumatizing for you, subconsciously, you may want to gain mastery over that situation. So, you may seek out friendships and partners in people who are quite invalidating subconsciously, and you reenact that traumatic experience out. So that might be another way it shows up. Obviously, we have unhealthy coping, like using drugs and alcohol. And then also, like the stories that we tell ourselves from the trauma. So, depending on what you go through, like I'm undeserving of love, people can't be trusted. That can show up in relationships again, like if you sabotage your relationship, if you withdraw, if you have difficulty trusting, if you're jealous. So there's a lot, right? But
Yes.
kind of can give you an idea of where those behaviors might kind of stem from sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be able to recognize them too in different situations. It's not easy to recognize them, but hearing them from you allows people to see that. It also totally calls me out because that was at some point in my life when I was that person that followed a pattern of behavior, and it took me 3 years to break it, to come to a different kind of like, okay, I have to make a change. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but it took me 3 years, and I really focused on my growth as a human. And so I can
Mhm.
speak to that side, that breaking patterns is so much harder than you think it is.
Totally. Yeah. And there's going to be sometimes two step forwards, one step back, right? So it
Yes.
is part of the journey for sure.
Yes. And I do, there are, I'm a huge believer in therapy. I've been in it for different parts of my life. I still have a therapist today. It's very
Mhm.
huge for me. But there are people out there that don't feel it's necessary or don't feel like they need it. Do you feel like trauma with that? Is there any other way to fix unresolved trauma than going to therapy? Or is that really the way that is going to help people?
Mhm. I mean, certainly I would say no, right? That's not always the way. I will kind of make a vouch for it, because if you think about that fight, flight, or freeze response and the lack of safety, that's going to happen if I ask you to think about the traumatic event. So if you're doing that alone, that's going to be really hard. You're going to activate that sense of unsafety and those trauma responses. And there's not going to be anyone there to hold a safe space for you and guide you through it, or give you new strategies to deal with like re-triggering yourself essentially. because you're going to re-trigger yourself and then use the coping strategy you know how to use, which may be unhealthy, or which we
Yes.
already talked about, right? But that being said, I will say that most approaches in therapy, not all, work from what I call like a top down approach. So it's a lot of talking, and it's a lot of, what thoughts do you have? What do you think? How do you feel? I'm asking a lot out of your brain to communicate with me. So that's why we call it top down. It's from the brain to the body. But there is tons of research. And if people are interested in this, you can look up the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but
That's
The
okay.
Body Keeps the Score is the book. And it talks about bottom up approaches. And that's when you work with your body to actually kind of deal and cope and process the trauma. Because what happens is when we go through really distressing and traumatic events, we can get disconnected from our body sensations. So when we get upset or distressed, that feels really uncomfortable in our bodies. And if we don't know how to cope with that feeling and that distress, our brains will protect us by shutting off our connection with our bodies. We don't want to feel how we feel anymore.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So part of this bottom up approach is, how do we get ourselves to a point where we can actually reconnect with our body and feel what our body is feeling without it being triggering? And part of that looks like maybe doing some yoga or doing some stretches and being like, how does this stretch in my arm and in my leg feel right now? And that is a kind of way for us to retrain our body to reconnect with, or retrain our minds to reconnect with our bodies. Also, when we get stressed out, you'll see this with animals and birds, is that there's a ton of energy that goes through our body and we need to release it. And that's why a dog will shake, right? You've seen like
Hmm.
your dog's really playful and you're like, okay, we're all done playing. Your dog will shake. It needs to expend that excess energy. But humans, we witness something traumatizing, we go through something traumatizing or distressing, and we just like sit there. Some people don't even cry, you know? And like that body there, that lives in our bodies. So we have to find ways to release it. So if people are interested in learning more about that, that's some of the things that you can do, is again like yoga, like moving, dancing. But also there's something called trauma intention release exercises, which I don't really recommend people do it on their own, but it's there if they want to look into it. Dr. Dave Berselli is the pioneer of that, and these are exercises that you can do with your body where you actually allow your body to release that energy, and you kind of start shaking to release it. And veterans, like war veterans, have used that as well. And it's
Wow.
kind of a way to release that excess energy. So, yeah, to make a long story short, there are tons of bottom up approaches that you can do at home, and that I think is lacking in talk therapy to work through trauma. Because yeah, I mean, the body keeps the score. There's a reason why that book is called that, right? It's we need to reconnect with ourselves.
Yeah, and there is I always see things on the internet and I follow legit sources, right? But I like to verify that information to make sure. There was somebody talking about our bodies. If you're feeling off in this current kind of timeline right now, it's because our body remembers, our cells remember when we entered into the pandemic in this moment. Is that something you've seen as well? Like, do our bodies or our cells genuinely remember things? And is there moments and years later where it's remembering something and you just aren't putting the pieces together?
For sure. If you think about a smell, have you ever smelt a smell and being like, oh, yeah, that reminds me of second year, like college when I was doing this? Or
Yes.
a song plays and you're like, oh, I remember that summer, like driving around this city, right? So these are all sensory and environmental cues that our body's picking up on. And for those examples, we can cognitively label them. But certainly there's going to be other examples, maybe a change in weather or a period of time in the year that's more subtle that we can't always necessarily put into words, but the body feels off. So certainly that does happen for sure.
Well, I think it's interesting too because for so many years, if I have like a weird day, I'm like, I just feel off and I don't know why, right? I'm sitting there, I'm like, I feel off and I can't explain it. I can just say, I just don't feel like myself.
Hmm.
But I feel so much like happiness is probably not the right word, but happiness knowing that like I'm not just saying that and I'm not just making that up in my
Yeah.
head. It's like actually validated. That's legit
Yeah.
that I'm saying that. And my body did actually feel off and I was listening to it. It's just I couldn't explain what that meant. So thank
Mhm.
you for telling me I'm not crazy.
No, of course not. Most of us are not crazy. We just haven't had the framework to explain what we're feeling and going through, right?
Yes, which is what's so awesome about the constant learning and then the constant evolution of us understanding more about our brains, our bodies, everything, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you also think too, like in that same vein, there's moments, especially after trauma or definitely after like difficult situations, we feel numb and we don't really do anything and we're just like, I just feel meh.
Mhm.
Do you feel that kind of connects to that same thing that you're talking about? Like if you're going through that, there's definitely something else going on that you kind of might need to address that you're not thinking of?
Yeah. And it could be a number of things. It could be perhaps fatigue. We can only put so much energy and emotion into, let's say, use grief, for example, right? Maybe in the beginning, it's like really intense, but after a while, it kind of numbs out because, like, you can't cry forever, right? So
Mhm.
it's kind of almost like emotional depletion and fatigue in a sense. But then there's also if it feels numb, and some clients explain it almost like an out of body experience. What we call in psychology is it could be dissociation. So it's that same protective mechanism where your brain is like, this is way too much, these feelings are way too intense, these bodily sensations are very threatening, so I'm going to protect you by numbing it out for you. And then you feel kind of like you're living an out of body experience, and that's what we call dissociation, and that can be a coping response for many, many people who have gone through both big and little T trauma.
Wow. I really enjoy the little T, big T trauma, like being able to put them in categories so I can understand them better. Great
Mhm.
tools there too.
Yeah.
Going on a more positive note, utilizing affirmations can be really beneficial, right?
Mhm.
What do you feel like is a good affirmation or a good constant affirmation to give yourself day to day that can really help you to kind of boost the positivity and boost things in your life?
hmm So before I get to that, I just want to say one quick thing about the big T and little T trauma is that you define what category it falls in, right? So I don't want people listening to be like, well, does this qualify as big T? Like, am I overreacting? No, like your experience is valid because it's your own. So if you define it as big T because it was very traumatic for you, then it was, and no one should tell you otherwise. So I want to say that
Yes,
too.
it's just giving you 2
Yeah.
categories to kind of put them in
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
in your own sense, yes.
Yes, yes, exactly. So the affirmations, I mean, I relate to you. I identify as a perfectionist myself. I'm working on it. I still am. So an affirmation that I really like is that, like, I'm doing the best that I can based on the resources I have and what I know right now. I also love comparison is the thief of joy. I like it's one of my favorite
Great one,
ones.
yes.
Yes. And then also that my accomplishments do not define my worth. That's a big one for me because one of my automatic coping responses work more, achieve more to gain that validation. And it's very unhelpful for me.
Do you feel like writing those down? What is the best way? Like, do you just constantly think about them? Do you make sure to write them down every day? Are they written somewhere in your house? What does that kind of look like for people who maybe want to utilize affirmations some more?
Mhm. So I have not looked into the research for this, so please take this as a grain of salt. But what I do is I like to listen to them in the morning or right before I go to sleep, because I find that in the morning and right before I go to sleep, there's like this kind of weird vibe where I'm like slipping into unconsciousness. It's like the bridge between consciousness and unconsciousness. So it's almost like I'm going to do some training with my unconscious mind. So I'm just like a little bit sleepy. So I'm like,
Yes.
maybe I'll get to my unconsciousness faster if I do it during those periods. But not
Okay.
backed by science, but that's kind of like my intuitive sense is I do it during those periods. But I would say, like, if you even have downtime, like you're waiting for the bus or walking to school or driving, listen to some on YouTube. There's great I am affirmations, and I find them so helpful. And if you want to make your own, maybe just record them too or write them down, like whatever works for you. But yeah, morning and evening is kind of my vibe.
I know, I love that, and I think that's a great tool because people use so many things to fall asleep and wake up. Just add that to the little mix, right?
Yeah.
Keep adding different things to help ourselves. And, too, we're talking about these affirmations. What do you see happens? Like, say somebody uses affirmations in a week. Do
Mhm.
you see them become more of a positive person? Do you see them kind of growing more? What is the benefit out of that? We think about it
Mhm.
in our brains and it helps our brains kind of think differently, but
Yes.
truly, what does it look like? So people, when they're doing these, like, they're like, what am I looking for? How is this supposed to help me?
Right. Yeah. So to answer your question, yes, I do see improvements. And it either shows up as just like people generally feel like maybe better that day. And I'm like, well, what did you do today? And they're like, oh, I listened to an affirmation in the morning. And I'm like, ding, ding, ding. Or it's kind of like, if you go through thing distressing during the day, we tend to have automatic reactions and thoughts about the situation. So, for example, like if I make a mistake, one of my automatic thoughts will be like, oh, I'm so dumb, I shouldn't be here. But I find that when we listen to affirmations, it almost like gives your brain some like new thoughts to work with. So instead of like, I'm so dumb, I shouldn't be here, I am able to think about the situation in a different way. And I feel clients, and I've noticed that clients are also able to do that too. And to kind of bring in a psych kind of perspective into it, by the way, as I'm talking, I'm noticing all the filler words I'm using. And I'm like, oh my
We
God.
address that, and I put it to the
Yeah.
every time I talk about that, I put it to
Yeah.
people's front of their brains, and they're like, "Why am I doing this?"
Yes, yes. So, but anywho, the brain is plastic. What that means is that it can always change. So I want people to think about the brain like a patch of grass with pathways on it. Okay. So let's say you tend to be quite self critical. You blame yourself a lot. Those are your automatic thoughts. And the pathways in your brain that have been walked down a lot, they're all stamped down, right? When there's a bicycle lane through a patch of grass and the grass is really short there, or it's kind of muddy because people have walked it over and over again. So the brain likes the path of least resistance. It's going to take those pathways all the time, which means you're always negative, you're always self critical. And then, even though there's a new pathway there, and maybe this is the positive pathway or the self love pathway, you're not going to walk that pathway because there's tons of grass in the way. You don't want to get your shoes dirty. You're like, there's a perfect path over here. I'm just going to walk this way. But what happens when we do kind of invite ourselves to think about a different way and listen to affirmations, you're feeding your brain a new perspective. So it is going to be hard at first to walk that new path. And yes, your shoes are going to get dirty. You're going to have to walk through the grass. But the beautiful thing about the brain is because it's plastic, that means eventually when we continue to walk down those paths, we're going to push down the grass more and more. And now that's going to be your new pathway that you walk. And even more beautiful is the old pathways. The grass is going to grow back in those pathways. And you can quite literally rewire your brain so that you have different automatic thoughts. So, affirmations is a way and a tool for you to really expedite that process because it can be hard to do it from yourself. I bet you some people are like, I can't even think of a sentence to create, right? And
Yeah.
that's what the internet is for, and YouTube and radio shows and whatever. There's so much information at the tip of our fingers. So
Yes.
yeah, it's definitely great. And our brains, yeah, they're beautiful. They can rewire themselves.
No, I love that, and I love a good metaphor that allows me to, like, picture the scene perfectly. I was picturing it as you were doing it, and I'm like, "This is amazing," because I also love mowing my yard, so this is, like, seriously the perfect metaphor for that whole situation, and I do think it is. It's very hard to be a positive person, right? It's very hard every day to wake up, get out of bed, and choose to be positive and choose to be happy when there's
Mhm.
a lot to be not happy about.
Mhm.
So, affirmations are a great way. Is there anything else that you feel like is a great way to kind of assert a positive kind of light over your life if things feel really heavy?
Mhm. I mean, I'm a big, big, big fan of meditation. It has seriously saved me. I know that it's a big buzzword and that maybe people get turned off by it, but really, I mean, we're not our thoughts, right? Our If you think about the way we can change our thoughts and how that changes how we feel, it's like, whoa, well then I'm not actually my thinking. I'm the person that chooses the thinking. I'm the observer of the thinking. I'm not actually the thinking. And that can, bring a lot of peace for people. So I think a way to practice being the observer of our thoughts is to meditate and to practice that, or at least be mindful in what we're doing, not doing things automatically, but being present. How does this feel? What does it taste like? What am I hearing? Those are all ways for us to be in the present moment and can be helpful. I think a lot of people spend time revisiting the past or creating stories about the future. And some of the spiritual teachings I've read is that the present moment is all we ever have. So if we're in the past or in the present, we're not actually living, right? And stepping into the present is a way for us to like live. And yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes things are hard and sometimes things come up, but when we resist that, it gives more life to it. So even if it is really crappy and distressing, the first step is kind of accepting that. Like it's okay to not be okay.
Yes, and I love that phrase. I don't care how old it gets, I will always say that phrase. It's okay to not be okay. That is
Mhm.
sometimes just exactly what you need to hear, and it's the perfect way to say it. And we are kind of talking about these thoughts that, aren't necessarily real, or if they're real, coming to terms with them in that same situation. There's a difference between feelings and facts, which is where a lot of
Mhm.
anxiety comes from for certain people. How can you recognize that you are misinterpreting the two? One's feelings, one's facts. How do you make sure you know that they are different?
Mhm. So I will say that one of the first things to do is, again, take a step back, right? We talked about how when we get emotional, that can hijack the thinking part of the brain. So it's going to be really hard for you to tease what is a feeling and what is a fact if your emotional brain is running the show. So I think that it's important to take a moment and relax the body first. And then secondly is also being careful about confirmation bias, is that we know based on the research that you are going to try to confirm what you believe. So being aware of that and that the brain tends to play tricks on you was important. And then after that is okay, well, when we think about feelings and facts, what we want to do is basically play detective with our thoughts. So take the thought that you're having, right? Even though it's a feeling, it's going to feel like the thought. So, for example, if you looked at me a funny way, I feel like you're annoyed at me. So now I'm like, she's annoyed at me, right? So then I take that thought, she's annoyed at me. And then I think, okay, well, what evidence do I actually have for this? What evidence am I missing? Okay. What would I tell a friend in this situation? Okay. If that were to happen, what can I do? There's all these questions that we can ask ourselves to essentially determine whether or not it's true or if it's just coming from a feeling. It's coming from like a fear or um, like an old belief, for example. So I want to invite people to be a detective, be a judge, and play detective with your own thoughts.
When I do think this is, a great point to also say this is why in two situations, like, my therapist that I have, she makes sure when I'm making really big decisions that I literally sit there and feel my entire body. She's like, if you have a big decision to make, sit in it. I want you to sit in it, and I want you to feel from your body, because your gut, your whole body is going to tell you if it's right or if it's wrong
Mhm,
every time.
mhm.
And I feel like that's what you're talking about, is kind of sit there with your thoughts and kind of really
Yeah.
understand what your whole body's trying to say to you. And also on that level, therapists do provide an unbiased opinion and an unbiased way of providing you with information that is otherwise hard to come by, right? It's very hard to have people in your life that are unbiased
Mhm.
to everything that you're experiencing. You're always going to have somebody pushing and pulling one way. So I do feel like, too, if you ever get so deep into this that you don't feel like you can accomplish it on your own, that is why they're there, and that's why they're beneficial. Would you agree with that?
100%, right? I mean, it's kind of a hard thing to be like, well, your brain is gonna play tricks on you, so try to catch your own brain playing tricks on you, right?
Yes.
It's a lot to ask, but I love that your therapist said, sit with it. Yeah, and really do that reflection. I'd also invite people to write it out. It's so hard to work through things in your head. Can't keep
Mhm.
track of it all. Write it out. Write everything out. Pros and cons, how you're feeling. Get it all out there and look at it. And it's all there for you to work through, not jumbled in your head, right?
Yes, and especially there are moments when I journal out and I look back on that, I'm like, I have no idea what I was talking about, but I needed
Yeah.
to write that out for some
Right.
reason.
Yes. No, exactly.
And I think that's a good thing, though. I think it's good for it, at the very least, it's out of your brain and into a piece of paper. So there's
Mhm.
something there about getting it out. And I do kind of want to end this on this note, because you and I are in a similar age bracket. We're probably experiencing similar things, but you're seeing it from a different perspective as a therapist. What do you feel right now is kind of the hardest thing that young adults are experiencing right now? We've been through a pandemic. We're seeing a lot happening in the news. There's so much going on. Do you feel like, what's the thing that you feel like we're really dealing with the most that maybe somebody needs a piece of advice on right now? Is it hard friendships? Is it toxic work environments? Is it dealing with breakups? What do you feel like is kind of the mass majority, if you could give a piece of advice to kind of the people that are likely dealing with this the most right now?
Mhm. Mhm.
I know that's hard. There's so much out there,
Mhm.
but I
I
do
know that.
see like young adults kind of leaning on each other to kind of cope in this situation that we're in. And it just feels very heavy. So if there's something you could offer kind of the entire age group as a whole, what do you
Yeah.
feel like that would be?
You know what? I think that it's experiencing a really intensified lack of control.
Yes.
I think that would kind of capture a lot of what I'm feeling and what I've seen in the therapy room. I mean, there was the pandemic, and then there's health, and then there's lockdowns, and now there's inflation, and then there was a war. And that's a lot. And I think the worst part about that, especially as someone who is, I would say, anxious, quite anxious, is that a lack of control is literally anxiety's enemy. Okay. Not knowing what's going to happen in the future. So I think in terms of advice is first acceptance, accepting that it is out of control and that that's okay. Because when we resist, we give more life to it, right? But there isn't anything that you can do right now to control some of these external things that are happening. The other thing, too, is write down what's in your control and what's out of your control. And that might give you a better idea of where you can place your energy. And then, even though it is uncomfortable and anxiety provoking, letting go of what is out of your control, focusing your energy on what is, letting go of what isn't. And sometimes just working through that, even though I'm not saying this is going to solve all your problems, but just working through that can kind of give your brain some clarity. So you can let go of some of those feelings of like, I'm just kind of like feeling this, but I don't know why. And it's making me anxious. you know, it's kind
Yes.
of like, okay, well, now I know the source of my anxiety. Now what?
I love that. I think that's a great piece of advice for everyone to hear in this moment of time that we're in right now, especially young adults. I know I'm feeling that, and I know you're feeling that from personal experience that you're talking about right now. So I think we all needed to hear just that little bit too, that we're also not alone in all of this. Everybody's feeling
Mhm.
very similar right now.
Yeah,
So thank
totally.
you. Yes, thank you so much for joining me, talking about all of these kind of different subjects. It was really great to hear from you, hear your perspective and your experience. And I so appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.